gives me great pleasure to introduce Myles, who needs no introduction. This is, I think, his 15th lecture in the series, as many of you have been before. And tonight we're going to hear all about net zero in the private sector. Myles, over to you.
Thank you, Robin. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you very much, particularly those who may be coming along for the first time. Thank you all for coming. And of course, each of these lectures is self-contained, and this one perhaps even more so than most, because we really are focusing on a specific topic. And as an academic myself, as somebody sort of safely in the public sector, I am conscious that it could potentially be quite annoying for people in this room who are doing their best to address net zero in the private sector, there's plenty of academics carping on, grumbling about what they're doing. So apologies in advance if I annoy people, and I'm sure you'll come back at me with the questions. But I wanted to talk about, for a lot of people, what they hear about net zero is the first time you hear about net zero might be advertisements from private companies saying, we're a net zero company, or, we have a net zero strategy or something, and that's something that it's worth thinking about what that means, what companies mean by making those claims, what investors mean in particular in making those kind of claims, and how much they're helping. And in particular, I'm introducing a new word to the dictionary. We'll see if it catches on. But as well as greenwashing, which I think a lot of people are very familiar with, I want you to think about the phrase Brownscraping. I'll just to explain where the phrase Brownscraping comes from. We're all familiar with the phenomenon over Christmas. There'll be a member of your family who likes to scrape the plates onto one plate and then park it and move on, pretending they've somehow tidied the kitchen. Yeah? You know who it is. And if it's you, you know who you are. And so Brownscraping is the corporate net zero analogy to that practice. You'll understand why as we go along. So I'm going to start talking about the granddaughter challenge for chief executives. And I'll explain to you what that means in a minute. And in particular, the Ørsted paradox. Ørsted, of course, was a very famous physicist, but in fact, I'm not talking about, I don't think Ørsted himself was responsible for any paradoxes, but I will be talking about Ørsted, the company, and the paradoxical nature of Ørsted's recent history. I'm going to be talking about how initiatives have been set up over the past decade or so, providing guidelines, more than a decade, for investors and corporate good practice in the transition to net zero, the kind of things that get invoked whenever you see these adverts saying that companies are net zero. And what I'll be arguing is, what I really want to question is whether good companies are what we need, or whether we just need good products. And it's actually quite a hotly contested philosophical question whether there is such a thing as a good company. But what I will try and convince you is there are definitely things, there are good and bad products that are good for the environment, products that are bad for it. And that's where I think we would usefully refocus our attention, rather than what we have been doing over the past decade or so, which is trying to discriminate between good and bad companies. There's a lot of sort of discussion about what makes a good company happens not this week, but next week. Next week, the titans of world commerce gather in a small Swiss village of Davos, and they sit around and they talk about the state of the world. I've only been to Davos once, said he, slightly bitterly, but they never invited me back. But Davos is an interesting, probably full disclosure before somebody points it out, my wife is going to Davos next week. And Davos it's a gathering of the great and the good, and she's definitely one of them. So I'm just bitter because I didn't get invited. But it's a meeting where politicians and chief executives of major international companies and so on get together to talk about the big issues that face us. And one of the things that I remember from the one time I did get to go to Davos, and I sort of got to sort of sit at the back of the room and see some of these talks from so on, was the thing which I found most irritating was the number of chief executives who, and they generally male, who would be sitting up on the stage talking about their granddaughters. Now, these are not, of course, Rishi Sunak's granddaughters, Rishi Sunak's daughters, but I don't know if you remember, a bit over a year ago, whenever Rishi Sunak mentioned the environment, he always talked about his daughters and how keen they were on recycling. And I just found this really annoying after a while. And I wonder what his daughters made of it anyway, but I guess we won't know because they're probably quite tactful. There is this sort of, people sitting up on stage saying, I've committed my company to net zero because I care about my granddaughters. And maybe that's a good sort of line of thinking, but it's sort of, after a while, it grates a bit. And this sort of poster, due to David Hembrow, where, the idea, oh, Daddy, what did you do in the climate war? And somehow that there's this chief executive sort of stroking his head thinking, well, I paid for your college education, didn't I? And by the way, David Hembrow, he's a blogger, and he went on to, his answer to that question was, I wrote lots of posts on LinkedIn, which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, what brought me, so when I'm a physical scientist by background, I'm a physicist, so I do natural science research on, for most of my career, I was just working on understanding what was happening to our climate and what what could be done about it. So up until the sort of the mid to 2010s, I hadn't really thought about the role of private companies in net zero because when you're looking at this from a physicist or as a natural scientist perspective, it's like the world's warming up. Governments need to do something and emissions need to come down, and those are the numbers. And that's the way we typically think about it. But of course, governments don't really emit. Some of our emissions are due to government activity, but most of the carbon dioxide that's generated around the world is generated by companies, private companies, making stuff, selling stuff, and of course individuals driving cars and heating our homes and so on. So the actions of companies matter. And one of the first, the first thing which drew my attention to this, or sort of forced me to think about the actions of private companies, was our own students in Oxford. This is from the most recent divestment campaign, but their first divestment campaign in 2017 or so, a group of students called the Oxford Climate Justice Campaign developed a very effective sit-ins, demonstrations, placards, and so on, to draw attention to the fact that the university, despite the fact that we were there to serve young people, that's what a university is for, was at the time still invested in fossil fuels. So we still had a relatively small amount of the university's assets were invested in fossil fuels, and they were arguing that we should withdraw our investments from fossil fuels. We should sell the university's holdings in fossil fuels. And I'll come back to this argument in a minute, but this is what, so they brought me in to talk to them because they knew that I was a climate scientist, and the Oxford Climate Justice Campaign clearly thought that I would be sympathetic to them. We had some really interesting conversations, which actually convinced me, I hadn't really thought about it very much up until then, but it kind of convinced me that if you want somebody to own a fossil fuel, then a university endowment is probably about right. So we ended up not really agreeing on what the university's strategy should be. But we'll come back to that in a minute. But the thing which really troubled me is what I've christened the Ørsted paradox, which is about a Danish company, the story of a Danish company, which sort of illustrates the challenge of investment and private investors trying to effect change in in the environmental arena. Just to tell you the story of Ørsted didn't start its life as a company with that name. It started off as the Danske Olie and Naturgas, I don't know how to pronounce it, but basically the Danish oil and natural gas company, founded in 1973 to pump oil and gas out of the North Sea. And they did that very effectively for a long time. And in 2006, they renamed themselves Dong Energy. And you probably, those old enough to remember the 2000s, remember all of the oil and gas companies. BP renamed itself Beyond Petroleum, or just BP, the oil and gas companies made a big point of rebranding themselves as energy companies, and this is what they were. And in 2017, they went one step further. They changed their name to Ørsted, who was a Danish physicist who did some fundamental work on the foundations of magnetism, and decided they were pulling out of oil and gas entirely. They divested, they sold off all their oil and gas assets and invested in wind energy. They became rapidly Europe's major wind energy supplier, and in 2020 they were ranked by the corporate knights. They were ranked the most sustainable company in the world. Well, we're now in 2025, and we're going to talk about what happened. But the first thing you have to ask yourself, actually, in this story, what's the sort of dog that didn't bark type question? So so Ørsted sold off all their oil and gas assets in the North Sea. What's the question you should immediately ask yourself whenever there's a transaction like that? Sounds great. They've got rid of their oil and gas assets. Yeah. So every vendor has a buyer. Every seller has a buyer. So who bought them? What happened to Dong Energy's assets? Well, actually, it's a nice simple story because they were all bought by not just one company, but virtually by one individual. They were bought by INEOS, which is a chemicals company. Up until that time, it was a chemicals company. It's an extremely successful chemicals company. It's a private company owned by, among others, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who is one of the most successful businessmen in Britain, business people in Britain. And he bought Dong Energy's oil and gas assets for £1 billion, $1 billion back in 2017. And INEOS have been continuing to operate these assets, extract oil and gas from the North Sea, ever since. And this is what happened to Ørsted's share price. So in 2017, they made the sale, they renamed themselves Ørsted, and it all went very, very well for quite a long time. And you can see 2020, when they were named the most sustainable company in the world, it was still going very well. And then Putin invaded Ukraine, the price of gas went through the roof, and suddenly investors rather lost interest in Ørsted's shares. Now, these kind of graphs are I find a little bit misleading, because you can sort of see, whenever you see that sort of smooth exponential takeoff of a share price, it always ends up like that. You just can't quite predict when it's going to sort of do the next thing. So I don't think that it's particularly, obviously people who bought Ørsted shares when they were over 1,000 Danish kroner probably lost a lot of money. But but share prices do that. That's the way the stock market works. So I don't think we should read too much into this. But what perhaps is more note, I can't show you the same graph for INEOS, because of course INEOS is privately owned, so it doesn't have a share price. It's Jim Ratcliffe's, basically. But I don't know if you were following the news relatively recently, but INEOS came pretty close to recovering the America's Cup. So, Jim Ratcliffe's not doing too badly out of his North Sea assets. And by the way, full disclosure, he's also given a very substantial and generous donation to the University of Oxford to set up our Institute for Antimicrobial Resistance, for working on the science of antimicrobial resistance. So, we've got this challenge that if you divest assets, you sell them to somebody. And so if the University of Oxford were to sell its fossil fuel assets, you'd be selling them to somebody else. And it's then impossible to, you then lose control over what is done with those assets. So that was the challenge and the discussion that we never really converged on between me and the Oxford Climate Justice Campaign. And the conversation continues. And that's one of the beauties of a university, is you get to argue. And you get to argue with everybody, including, one of the things I love about a university is that we have excellent students who are more than willing to argue with their professors, and encourage you to argue with your teachers and your professors when you go to university, because that's how both sides learn to look at things in a different way. The first thing we need to understand, and so that's the INEOS story, is why I'm just explaining why I think it's the answer to the question of divestment from fossil fuels and what universities should do and so on. That's why I think it's complicated. By the way, the Oxford Climate, if they were here, the Oxford Climate Justice Campaign would no doubt say there's another side to this, as well as the practical question of trying to influence company behavior. There's a moral question of whether a university should benefit from activities that are destroying the climate. And that's actually a very entirely reasonable argument, and one that I think is actually the strongest case for selling off fossil fuel assets is the moral one, if you just don't feel that you should be benefiting from this activity. The practical arguments, the operational case for doing it, I think are much less strong. This whole field, just to sort of step back a bit, has been developing for a long time. And back in the 2000s was really the advent of something called the Carbon Disclosure Project. A lot of this actually developed in London. London's been quite the Square Mile in London actually has been quite a pioneer of this whole topic. So the disclosure challenge, of course, is working out if you're looking at a company, if you're an investor looking at a company how do you know what they're up to? How do you know what harm they're doing, what harm their products are doing? And so what CDP was, and what CDP really came to characterize, was the process of interrogating companies to find out what they were doing above and beyond their profits. So they were making money and selling goods and so on, but what was the company? What was the company's impact on the environment? What was their impact on society? How strong were their governance and so on? So CDP developed a sort of process of sending companies elaborate questionnaires, which the companies would have to fill in, and they would get a score, and for their to say how they were doing on the among other things, the environmental transition, particularly focused on the environmental transition, and that information was channeled through to investors, and this was kind of the model of how it was meant to work. And there's lots of acronyms and institutions here and so on, so I'm unapologetically just picking a few examples to represent these groups. Lots of other groups rate companies as well as CDP. I think CDP was one of the earliest ones. And there's lots of other investor groups thinking about the climate challenge. But again, one of the longest standing is the Institutional Investors on Global Climate Change, Institutional Investor Group on Climate Change. And this is their goal is to get investors to channel money towards helping the transition towards a greener future, towards net zero. And when they were founded, the model was, and I found this juxtaposition of comments on their website recently, which I think puts the challenge rather well. So I'm just going to quote it. So I think they're sort of historically their goal was reducing financed emissions. And what they mean by that was that they were aiming to get their members to reduce the amount of money that was invested in companies that were generating CO2, or reduce the amount of CO2 that was being generated in companies owned by these investors. And the idea was to try. But the problem with that, of course, is that if that's what you tell your investors to do, you end up with the Ørsted case. People just back away and sell fossil fuel companies, sell companies that are generating carbon dioxide, and they end up in other people's hands who are not members of the IGCC, and therefore, sort of almost by definition, are not tracking not as enthusiastic as the members of IGCC on reducing the emissions. So I think it's generally agreed that just doing that doesn't work. The philosophy, just to be fair to our forebears, so to speak, back in the 2000s, the philosophy was that if enough investors declined to finance a particular sector, it would become more expensive for that sector to raise money, and therefore it wouldn't grow as rapidly as other sectors. Whereas if investors preferentially invested in certain sectors, then it would make money. It would make money cheap for the activities that you want to grow, and that was the philosophy behind it. And on the positive side, I think there is some evidence that it did work, in the sense that institutions like the IGCC did encourage investment in wind and solar energy at a time when it was probably not that. We probably wouldn't have been investing in it as enthusiastically as we were doing if there wasn't lots of peer pressure for investors to actually invest positively in the transition. So one consequence of that, of course, was that the share prices of wind and solar companies, were often inflated, which made it very easy for them to raise money to build wind and solar parks. Of course, it also meant that people quite often lost money because, if you raise money easily and you may not make that money back. But it did get a lot of renewable energy infrastructure built back in the sort of 2000s to 2010s. So in a sense, on the positive side, it probably was quite successful. But on the negative side, in terms of, putting the brakes on the fossil fuel industry, I'm not sure how much evidence there is that all of these initiatives really made much difference at all, because whenever you wanted to sell a fossil fuel asset, there was always somebody around to say, yeah, it's all right, I'll take that off you. So these days, the IGCC is sort of, they're reflecting on their role, and they're saying what they really want to do is finance reduced emissions. So they actually want to target investment at reducing emissions rather than just trying to pull it away from companies that are responsible for. And I think that's a very sensible philosophy. It's a sensible evolution in their way of thinking. How much does this... So I've been talking about investors, people who sort of just buy and sell and invest in companies rather than people who actually run companies themselves. And so at this point, we do have to ask ourselves, how much does it really matter? I mean, people worry about, there's a lot of invective at the moment, particularly in the United States, against environmental, social, so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds or investors who are using environmental, social, and governance criteria to decide which company they're invested in. Larry Fink of BlackRock gets routinely flamed. I'm sure if he's going to Davos, I'm sure he'll have people shouting at him. Maybe he's going to the inauguration, in which case he's certainly going to get shouted at. I don't know. Anyway, poor chap. But BlackRock have made a point. They're one of the biggest investors in the world. They have made a point of trying to apply some criteria for the environmental, social, and governance criteria to the companies they invest in, as have many others. I mean, so here you can see between 2020 and 2022, there was a massive growth in the amount of money invested in the world that was explicitly saying we're only going to invest in companies that satisfy some standard of environmental, social, and government ESG standard. But does it really matter is the question. So, by the way, first question is, you'll see that it's gone up, but now it's sort of plateaued out. And if anything, it's quite difficult to get hold of up-to-date data like this, because I think it all gets quite valuable when it gets up-to-date. So sorry about the fact that this graph runs out in 2023, but from looking around online, I think the trend in 24 is definitely has carried on downwards. So people are no longer as enthusiastic as they were at investing in ESG funds, but we have to ask ourselves: does it really matter what investors are doing? Because here's two lines that as a climate scientist, I'd look at these two lines and say, well, they're basically the same, because in my world, a little difference like that is neither here nor there, and this is basically the difference between a stock market index, so an average value of a whole bunch of companies, for all companies in blue, and for companies that have good environmental standards and are trying to reduce their emissions and are satisfying social and governance criteria as well, in yellow. And you can see the main message of the people writing this article was, look, the ones in yellow have done better than the ones in blue. But the main message to me is they're kind of the same. And which does make you ask, well, okay, one response to that is, okay, so it doesn't matter whether you're investing in, whether you're applying these ESG criteria to your investments or not. But another question you have to ask is, how confident can we be that actually applying these criteria has really made any real difference to the actual sort of portfolio of activities that you've done? I mean, to be fair, of course, because you've got to be careful here. I mean, this index, it does exclude certain things like, cluster bombs and thermal coal and that sort of thing. But by and large, there's not that many companies in that category anyway. So it doesn't really change the overall look. So to come back to the divestment discussion we had with the students who were campaigning to make sure that Oxford sold our shares in oil and gas companies, sort of a typical academic way, having had a long discussion with the students, we decided we needed to write a paper about it, the academics. And what came out of this was something called the Oxford-Martin Principles for Climate Conscious Investment, when we sort of asked ourselves, well, what should investors ask when they're thinking about investing in a company or staying invested in a company? And we came up with three questions. First of all, has the company even acknowledged that we need to get to net zero at all? Does it have a commitment? Has it committed to net zero emissions, to stopping, to net zero being what it takes to stop causing climate change? The second question, I think, is equally important. Does the company have a profitable net zero business model? And you may think, well, why, if you're thinking about ethical questions, should you worry about whether the company's profitable? But if a company's telling you, in 10 years' time, we're going to stop making any money, That's not very plausible, because then in 9 years' time, their shareholders and their workers and their directors are probably going to say, well, wait a minute, we want to keep our jobs. So you've got to be able to see how the company is not only going to plan to achieve net zero, but also how it's going to be profitable in a net zero world. And then the third thing which we asked for is, has the company set itself some quantitative medium-term targets, milestones 2030, 2035, 2040 along the way, so that you can actually see if it's doing anything, rather than just saying rather vaguely, oh yeah, don't worry about it, we'll be net zero in 2050. As an example of the kind of company that wouldn't satisfy this, I've used this example before, but for those who are new to this, there's a company that wants to open a coal mine in Cumbria. At the moment, this has been sort of on again, off again, but the coal mine was approved back in 2022. And the coal mine was approved on the grounds that it was completely consistent with Britain's net zero 2050 strategy, because the license only ran till 2049. So that's what I would say, that doesn't satisfy these criteria, okay? Just saying, don't worry about it, we're going to run the coal mine till 2049, then we're going to shut it down. That doesn't work, okay? So, we need to know what's the business model for a net zero world, and how are you going to measure your progress towards it, rather than just making some kind of vacuous promise, oh, don't worry about it, we're going to shut down at the right moment. So Oxford University did adopt these principles eventually, and we don't do things in a hurry in universities. One thing, when you go to university, you should appreciate this. Universities operate very, very slowly, and so the students. The way the students put it was that Oxford divests from fossil fuels. If I'm pedantic, I would say that's strictly not what Oxford decided to do. We actually just decided to adopt these principles, but at the time, that meant divesting from fossil fuels, because there were no fossil fuel companies which you could answer yes to all of these questions. And maybe, well, anyway, that situation is changing, but it's certainly changing very slowly. By the way, the first question was an interesting question. We are actually coming back, and in fact, Charlotte's here in the room, who's actually working on the updates to these, or thinking about how we update these principles at the moment, because some of the questions no longer really help us at all, particularly the first one. Does the company have a commitment to net zero emissions? I mean, at the time, in 2018, it's interesting, it's not that long ago, that was a real question, because lots of companies didn't. But then within about a year, they all did. And so it was kind of a pointless question, because everybody said, oh, yeah, we're very committed to net zero. So that's the direction we went as a university. And you'll notice the difference here is not where do we put our money, you're just moving money from one company to another, but asking questions about what the company itself is doing, and therefore engaging with the company to find out how it plans to transition. And we're not the only group doing this, of course, at all. And in fact, the leading group in the world, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, this is what they do. They set science-based targets for companies to provide guidance so that both investors and companies, and indeed increasingly regulators, can differentiate between companies that are notionally on track to net zero and companies that are not. The SBTi's got into all sorts of trouble recently. It's one of these things, it's an interesting history, SBTi, and you get a feel for the people involved, because it started as a small non-profit, an NGO, and it was providing guidance for companies, but also so rating companies, but also advising companies. So they were sort of they had an advisory capacity as well. They wanted to help companies along the way. And then suddenly, in a space of a couple of years, because some regulators, in particular in the United States, started to say, if you want to call your fund ESG or something, if you wanted to brand your investments as compliant with environmental standards, the companies you invested on had to have something like an SBTi badge. And so this relatively small non-profit was suddenly pushed into a really influential role in a way that actually I think the regulators, with hindsight, they should have seen this coming and they shouldn't have done it that way, because it's not fair to dump the task of regulation on, it was sort of a case of basically the state being a bit lazy and expecting a non-profit to do their job for them, if you like. I think that was, and so the SBTi has had a rocky couple of years, and a few months ago, there was a massive row over a question about including the SBTi allowing companies to use carbon offsetting to meet their net zero goals. We've actually got a specific lecture on carbon offsetting because it's such a thorny topic. So please come back on the 4th of March to hear all about carbon offsetting. But I would have to spend the rest of this time talking about carbon offsetting if we were going to delve into that. But what the SBTi does is they set a goal for a company, and they say, look, if you're going to credibly say you're going to be at net zero by 2050, you need to have reduced the amount of emissions generated by what you do by this and such amount by 2030 and so on. And what they do is they use scenarios, so models of the world economy, to say what makes sense for different sectors. So notice here the power sector, for example. That's electricity generation, in models which achieve net zero as cheaply and cost effectively as possible, we decarbonize power very rapidly. So that's why, for example, here in the UK, there's a big push at the moment to get our electricity system off fossil as fast as possible. That's really our government's main priority at the moment for net zero. And then other sectors are expected, for good reason, to go slower because it's harder for them to do it. So, for example, the dark blue line you see on the outside there, that's cement, the cement sector. It's very difficult to decarbonize cement. It's very expensive because the process of producing cement generates carbon dioxide. So that's expected to take longer to get there. The difficulty is, and so these are sort of basic principles, which I think everybody can kind of agree on. But the difficulty, of course, is when you translate these, as the SBTi has to do, into numbers. Because the whole point about business, the whole way in which business is meant to work, is people have different views about what things are worth and what's going to happen in the future. And if you tell everybody that, no, we're all going to use this many, disposable razors in a given month, and we will all use the same type and so on, then you don't really have any competition between companies, and business doesn't really work anymore. So the whole idea of the way our system is intended to work is that people can have different views about the future, and then they compete with each other, and somebody's right and somebody's wrong, and the one who's right makes more money. That's the whole idea. But when you've got a sort of group building scenarios and feeding them through the Science-Based Targets Initiative to a standard setter saying that all companies have to do this, then suddenly you're removing that ability of companies to compete with each other. And, this particular gentleman would say, this is, anybody recognize who this is? Sorry, it's a slightly fuzzy photograph. At one point he was looking like he was going to be the next president of the United States, and now we've got another one. So this is Ron DeSantis saying we rebelling against the idea of people setting ESG standards to tell companies what to do, because his argument would be, we want government of laws, not woke CEOs. Although I couldn't resist pointing out, given who seems to be in charge in the US at the moment, they've got CEOs in charge, just not woke ones. Anyway, but there we are. Maybe Ron DeSantis is happy with that outcome. So the challenge we have is with these two sort of themes of the talk is that aligning investment portfolios with net zero, so basically sort of moving your money away from brown into green, which was the sort of in vogue thing to do up until 2 or 3 years ago. What it could do is just encourage what we were calling brownscraping, scraping all the brown stuff onto a plate and then parking it and ignoring it. Yeah, and that's kind of what it has done. It's resulted in a lot of fossil fuel assets, particularly coal assets, being transferred from publicly owned companies where there are shareholders and where people have to sort of get to go to meetings and vote and so on what the company's doing, to private equity holdings where they're totally unaccountable. And that's the direction in which a lot of certainly the least popular energy assets have gone. And the idea of setting corporate strategies to make sure they're net zero aligned, like the SBTI, like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, risks the standard setters essentially taking on the role of management, telling management what to do. And the difficulty is when you've got one standard setter telling the management of a whole lot of companies how they're supposed to behave, then, well, Ron DeSantis would argue, well, that's anti-competitive. I mean, the flip side of Ron DeSantis' argument is, of course, government of laws, not woke CEOs. Yes, Ron, but we do need laws. I mean, so I think that's where, the reason we have all this enthusiasm, of course, for environmental standards in companies and so on, is because basically the regulators aren't doing their job. And so we need all this additional layer of activity to compensate for that. So, look, I don't want to be sort of standing here just being entirely negative, so I want to end on sort of a positive suggestion. I always try to be positive in these lectures. Is there a better way forward than investors thinking about how to decarbonize their portfolios, or companies setting companies these so-called science-based targets for their activities? And so I think one way of thinking about this is to frame it in this way, the ultimate question for every CEO. And how do you plan to stop the stuff you sell? Stuff might be a product or it might be a service, from causing global warming by 2050. I got to ask this question of Vail Sawan, the CEO of Shell. And he didn't have an answer for it, by the way. Maybe he does by now, but at the time he didn't. Because, of course, Shell makes its money selling oil and gas. And they don't really have a plan to stop oil and gas causing global warming. They say they're committed to net zero, but if we focus on the product, they don't really have an answer to how they're going to stop that product from causing global warming. Just saying, I already quoted the Cumbria coal mine example. So just saying, don't worry about it, it's not our problem, we're going to stop selling this stuff in 2049. That obviously doesn't work because, well, for two reasons. First of all, it means that you're still causing harm all the way up to 2049, so it's bad for the planet. It's very bad for your customers because it means you're keeping your customers, as it were, addicted to your product all the way up to 2049, then leaving them high and dry. So and it's very bad for your shareholders as well, because it means that you haven't really got a sustainable long-term business model. So that shouldn't be the answer. So the question is, how do you plan to stop the products or the services you sell from causing global warming by 2050? And on this, we have to be very clear what causing global warming means. It has to include both direct and indirect influences of these products. And by the way, at this point, I'm kind of thinking aloud here, because I think my thinking in this is still evolving, and so I'm interested in people's thoughts on this. But it's definitely true that it can't just include the direct impact of a product or service, because if you there's lots of instances, I can quote you, I'll quote you a couple as we go along, where you might fix product A, but make product B cause more harm as a result. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. But just to sort of, this is all a bit philosophical, so just to really focus on a specific example, I'm going to focus on a very particular question that troubles particularly, well, should trouble lots of academics because it's our main way in which we cause global warming, which is flights. So how do we stop flights from causing global warming? And I'm asking this question in a very specific way. I'm not asking how do we stop flying from causing global warming, but how do we stop flights from causing global warming? And the difference between those two questions is that if I ask you how to stop flying from causing global warming, you could answer, well, stop flying. So a company could answer that question by saying, yeah, we're an airline right now, but we're going to become a shipping company. Okay? That's not an answer because it just means they're just passing the problem on to somebody else. So we have to ask the question specifically about how do we stop flights from causing global warming, the flights themselves. And by the way, we've got Oxford Net Zero has a project actually thinking about this very question, funded by Vietjet Air, which is a Southeast Asian airline, which is growing very rapidly. They have no intention of stopping the population of Southeast Asia from flying. In fact, they're encouraging them to fly as much as they can, but they are interested in stopping the flights themselves from causing global warming. So full... Vietjet are putting their money where their mouth is, and are working with us and with IATA, the International Air Traffic Association, to think about how we address this problem. Here's what the official managers of global aviation, or institutions like, let's focus on IATA, the International Air Travel Association. They're the sort of body of airlines, they're the sort of like the trade body of airlines. And so one of these scenarios, which they've called their net zero scenarios, the blue one, you can see how it sort of the green one, where you can see it goes up a little bit, then it goes down, and gets very close to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050. And you can ask, how do they think, so this is a plan for the industry as to how they could achieve net zero. And one thing, this is IATA's roadmap. This shows you how they do it. And the first thing to notice is that they don't do it by stopping flying. I mean, they are the trade association of the world's airlines, so I guess that's to be expected. But so we couldn't accuse them of being like the Cumbria coal mine example and just saying, no, we're going to tap out and do something else. In fact, they predict that flying will increase, and they're probably right. The world is getting very enthusiastic about flying more and more. What they suggest is we're going to do several things which make a small contribution. They're going to run planes more efficiently, they're going to improve operations, and there might be some contribution from electric aircraft, but you can see from this, there's the electric one, there's the technology and operations one. They're quite small bars. These are the big ones are these two, which are both SAF, sustainable aviation fuel. Okay, so now replacing the fuel, the kerosene, which goes into the planes, with fuels that don't cause global warming. And finally, this one, carbon removal / offsets. And so we're going to talk about the carbon removal side of that now. So these are the big contributors: biofuel SAF, power to liquid SAF, and carbon removal offsets. So what are these? What are these different? So this is actually the main. When you see adverts, if you're going through Heathrow, about how certain companies are solving the climate problem, they're probably talking about this, making aviation fuel from used cooking oil. It's a huge industry. Here's an example of some cooking oil, which was going to get reprocessed into aviation fuel. And of course, because it's come from plants originally, that doesn't result in the release of fossil carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The challenge, however, most of this cooking oil comes from Southeast Asia, and in Southeast Asia, quite often, used cooking oil is now more valuable than virgin cooking oil. Why? Because you can sell used cooking oil to make aviation fuel. And you can see immediately who's really sustainable here. Yeah, because basically you're encouraging people to use as much cooking oil as possible in order to be able to sell it to make aviation fuel. So this is where that sort of indirect effect test comes into play. Is the airline that's using sustainable aviation fuel only able to claim that they're sustainable because they're making the palm oil business that's generating the cooking oil unsustainable? So it's that's an indirect effect that you need to worry about. The other way in which we're planning to make flights sustainable are by making the sustainable aviation fuel directly from the air. So this is a facility in Zurich, an experimental facility, where they're actually capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, capturing water from the atmosphere, and using sunlight to synthesize fuel to fly a plane, which sounds fantastic. And we have other OxCCU, spin out from Oxford University, is doing the same thing. More accurately, they're making fuel from carbon dioxide and hydrogen. Again, this all sounds wonderful, but actually the biggest generator of fuels from carbon dioxide and hydrogen is TotalEnergies, in Europe at least, in their Gonfreville refinery. And if you look at that, you think, well, that doesn't look nearly as glamorous and smart as those other facilities. So what's going on here? Well, what's not to love about making fuel from sunlight and air? Well, the first thing not to love about is it costs a lot. I mean, it's incredibly expensive to do this because actually taking carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere is very expensive. It requires a lot of energy to do it. So actually, in Europe at the moment, most carbon dioxide to fuel synthetic aviation fuel instead of using carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it uses waste carbon dioxide coming out of a refinery. Okay, so that makes sense. I mean, it does, of course. It's much more cost effective. It uses much less energy. You're generating this carbon dioxide anyway, so why not capture it, turn it into a fuel? But of course, it still doesn't pass our indirect impact test, because in that situation, the fuel is sustainable only because all of the other products coming out of the refinery are totally unsustainable. So we've got to think about, we've got to address it. I want to crack on to leave a few minutes for questions. So I'll sort of look forward to the offsetting lecture to talk about the idea of taking the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. But I mean, one of the things a lot of people in Wales are very concerned about is moves to plant lots and lots of trees all over Wales to mop up the CO2 from flying. This is already happening in countries like Liberia, where the carbon there is under offer. But there are ways in which you can capture CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it back underground, such as the Climeworks direct air capture facility, where you really are capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the Earth's surface. So the challenge we have for disposing of carbon dioxide, so this is the alternative to making fuel from air, is you burn fuel anyway, but then recapture the carbon dioxide from the air and put it back underground. The challenge there is that if it's a biological approach, like planting trees all over Snowdonia or using the forests of Liberia, then you're occupying land that would otherwise perhaps be producing food or be needed to mop up carbon anyway. And so again, you don't pass the indirect impact test. There is one question a lot of people do ask is, well, wait a minute, if you're putting CO2 underground, you're filling up the rocks with CO2, so you still can't pass the indirect impact test. And we'll come back to this in later lectures, but I would argue that experience suggests that actually the best way to increase resources underground is to use them, which is a bit weird. But every time we've increased our amount of oil we use, we find more. And I think the same works in the other direction for getting rid of CO2. But that's, I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to leave you that one as just something to mull over. Why is it that whenever we use more oil, we seem to increase the amount of oil available underground? So just to sum up, we've talked about how investment standards create this phenomenon I'd like to call Brownscraping, scraping all the nasty stuff onto a plate and parking it rather than actually fixing it. Science-based targets are fine in principle, but they do run this risk. They are open to this accusation that they're discouraging competition, that they're not really consistent with the idea of just allowing companies to form views about the future themselves and then letting them compete with each other. So the way forward, I think, for net zero in the private sector is to think much more to focus our attention much more on the products and services themselves. And finally, we're going to come back to this in the final lectures of this series. All of these voluntary standards and NGOs saying this is a good product, this is a bad product, and so on, it's not going to ultimately cut the mustard. At the end of the day, governments have to step up and regulate and say, no, this is causing harm, don't do it. This is okay and you're allowed to do that. So in the end, ultimately, a lot of these paradoxes we've seen in the way the private sector has been engaging with the net zero challenge have arisen. And just to be clear, I don't want to blame the bankers and the consultants and so on who are doing this. They've been forced into doing a lot of things that ultimately I think governments really should have been doing if they'd been up to the job in the first place. Anyway, that's some thoughts for you, and I'm hoping there'll be some questions. Thank you.